В начале XX века немецкий мыслитель Wilhelm
Winderband, in the beginning of the 20th century, was writing things which were believed to be somewhat strange. He was writing that the German nation would go through a very dangerous period if it forgets the heritage of Friedrich Hölderlin, a great German poet. What does Hölderlin has to do with it? And what does Friedrich Hölderlin have to do with the future of the European continent? Many spoke about crisis. Spengler, with his the dawn of the dusk of Europe. It's Musil, with his famous novel *The Man Without Properties*. It is Paul Valéry. It is, of course, Kafka and Proust and Zamyatin and many others. In other words, we were talking about the need to transform our thinking, to depart from a very comfortable harbor of conventional wisdom, which a harbor, I have to confess, is a lot more comfortable. It becomes a very sterile harbor. And starting from the time of Plato and classical antiquity, and going through the Enlightenment, became more and more self-assuming. A place which is nice to be. However, there is the real world. And what is to be done to discover the possibilities which have nothing to do with any man-made theories? Because as man-made theories is what we create ourselves. Hannah Arendt, the great German thinker and author of the 20th century, turned to the topic of the essence of totalitarianism. And quite like Ortega y Gasset, she turned to the issue of totalitarianism not just as a subject for theoretical research. To her, a person who was banished from her own country went through a personal tragedy as to how the German nation, not indeed the most illiterate nation, a people with huge culture and civilization in philosophy, in painting, in philosophy, in music, in literature, how could it descend into this abyss of barbarianism? And when we think about what the Germans did is worse than any beasts would do to each other. And Hannah Arendt writes about the banality of evil. And we can see here that the veneer of knowledge, the very thin film of culture, is extremely thin and vulnerable. And it simply cannot and does not protect mankind from fall. The question then arises, what are the roots of such terror? And can we move forward if we believe that this is a predestined line of mankind? Or else should we talk about responsibility, which could help and modify something in our thinking? Not for the benefit of some theoretical suppositions or desires, but in direct relation to the reality which we cannot evade. Hannah Arendt, in her work Between the Past and the Future, has two chapters. One is called Crisis in Culture, and another one is called Crisis in Education. These are two of the chapters of this book. It is interesting that Hannah Arendt, who was a bilingual author, is not translating the word education as Bildung, although we understand the differences in connotation between education and Bildung. No, she translates this as Erziehung, as upbringing. And to me, this was very interesting. She called this upbringing. I think that the connotation, this connotation, is most important. But does this suggest that we must believe that something exists in man only as a potential, because a human being is not endowed with everything required to live in this world. And indeed, Arthur Koestler once wrote that man is a mistake of the civilization, and it's a sad thing to say. But one just has to bear in mind that to nurture the humane qualities in man, it requires a big labor, big effort. So there is a certain program which may or may not take into account some facts. The birds fly, the snakes crawl. There is no deviation from the program. For man, this is a program which is being formulated from the first days of our lives, and it can be formulated in different ways. And then the question arises, but is there something in mentality, something immanent, something indispensable for us as humans? Or this deal with something that is subject to development, to nurturing? In one of in the Life of the Mind, one of her last works, Hannah Arendt, The Life of the Mind, Arendt starts by quoting from Heidegger, a German philosopher with whom she was intimate. So, unfortunately, this work was not finished. And I'm quoting Heidegger from a translation into Russian. What is thinking? Thinking does not bring knowledge as science does. Thinking does not give practical wisdom. Thinking does not solve the riddles of the universe. Thinking does not endow us with the power to act. This is strange that such a statement, which indeed drives us to think, moves us to think, what is mentality? And then the question arises, how come and what happens to, what can we do to try and contribute to the formulation of such thinking in humans? Quite unfortunately, a big part of the 20th century was darkened by the confrontation between the two systems and later the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one may remember that by meeting the 21st century, which was, of course, also the beginning of the third millennium. And we know that dates can be very emotional. How people wished to believe that the tragic history of the past, including the tragic history of the 20th century, was now behind us firmly. So, in 2001, 9/11 strikes in America, and we become witnesses of the not quite very successful attempts to influence the reality in the Middle East in 2008. The world is struck by the financial crisis, which we're very slowly recovering from, although there is no guarantee that a new one would not strike. And of course now we are encountering the threat of terrorism, the great flows of refugees, the growth of populism, of nationalism, Mr. Trump, Brexit, Catalonia, and we are trying, post factum, to consider what has happened. And every time we find out that things come in an unexpected way. Yesterday's events in Germany have shown that the votes for the alternative Germany predominantly came from the east of Germany. And how come, one may ask a question, that the German people, which has for over 25 years, with all the great efforts towards integration of East Germany, and of course great monies, about 2 trillion euros, were expended for it. And we're just talking about one nation.
Same culture, same past, same language, and about a big attempt at integration. And we can see how difficult it may be, again, I repeat, within the same culture and for the same nation. What can you say when culture, say European culture, goes beyond what is known as life world, that is a world that is very unlike European, that was shaped and could not probably go through, is known that enlightening, this is something we discussed today, in antiquity. In ancient times, man faced situations where he lived organically in this world. He belonged to this world. He felt he belonged to this cosmos, and he felt limitations imposed upon his own fate, because if, as we know, the hero attempted violating the laws of this cosmos, established order, in the long run, the hero would always be defeated. Christian times, the thing was that man realized his own sins, his own imperfections. And the problem was how to overcome all that. But enlightenment brought about a very new paradigm. I mean, enlightenment not only education, but paradigm of society's development. And man would get into situations where what used to be sacred, which was something very unconditional, he would come up with something that was his own. And we're now at a stage where one should realize that thinking should become existential. In other words, this is the thinking that should become an attempt of our answer to reality, instead of our craving to impose upon this reality some theoretical schemes that we coin, because the effect would be very very unexpected. We now look at a certain stage in the development of European culture, which goes back to ancient Greece. You may remember in Plato's dialogues, they're discussing legend, which says that a young girl was ironic about Thales, man who looked at celestial bodies, who spoke about non-terrestrial matters as he contemplated something that goes beyond our earthly things. But at the same time, he fell into a well, and this practical girl is laughing at him. How can you look at problems in celestial problems if you don't have elementary practical skills? How good is this contemplation of celestial values if you are not coping with domestic and earthly things? Of course, the problem of shaping a creature that is known as biotheoreticus is a problem of inevitable attitude and man towards nature, towards all things around him and that are not within his power to harness these forces of nature. But regrettably, this sort of model of cognition, which brought to powerful development of natural studies, and seeking to harness natural forces. We know what it stands for, these harnessing and conquering nature, what a price we have to pay for that. There's conquest and subjugation of nature. But the model that ensued was that factual, individual and actual is being ignored because for natural sciences it plays no role whatsoever. This was something that was transferred to human reality, but when applied to humanities, we see that what matters is our own life, our culture, our tradition, attempting to take it based upon some abstract principles, being sure that these principles are right. Seeking to impose them will inevitably lead to a fact that people would reject that. What comes to the fore is the problem of language that we use as we appeal to some culture, where we find out, we realize this culture stays immune compared to the language of values that we use as we appeal to the culture. Well, it stays immune. An idea that how things should stand in Afghanistan or Syria come across lack of understanding, are met by lack of understanding for those who don't have what it takes to perceive the signal, I mean the antenna. We speak a different language. It is a communication between two parallel worlds that don't overlap, and we can stay convinced as long as we can that we are right. Recently, they just discussed that we have universal values. Yes, if these values are truly universal, then we should find a language to translate these values in keeping with the quality of individual minds, and not to try to speak to this mind in a language that it does not understand. Well, the problem of language is very serious. I would like to give you a very curious utterance, which is now almost forgotten by our culture. They are words by
которые относятся
that belong to a long time past. One of them was uttered by Leibniz, who in his day wrote in his treatise New Experience on Human Reason, had a chapter on abuse of words. This is what he wrote. People take words which they meet and use from one word from their neighbors, not to feel. They don't know what these words mean. And they are using them with trust, never incurring any particular meaning to that. To disillusion them means is as much as take away the only home from a homeless person. Again, a Russian thinker, Bulgakov, in his work Philosophy of Name, wrote the following, I'm quoting. He spoke about the dangers of verbosity, the danger of being light-minded in words. This is something that we find in cognition, in utterances, the danger of misconception of combining words and ideas, this thought of both, disease of both mind and utterance, should be understood in its ontological foundations. The word is now covered by the cloud of verbiage, and now we understand only those things that are just like idle talk translated into verbiage. That's just words and words and words. Original words, the language of things, this is what makes sense. In 1946, an outstanding European thinker, Søren Kierkegaard, as he thought to contemplate things which we just discussed, and he was not quite a success. We're not quite a success at that. And he showed that many words, many things can be contemplated and analyzed not post factum, not like a physician realizes that something is wrong when he sees myths, when the body is close to very severe pathology. When he sees first shoots, and many people just disregarded them. I have a book by Kierkegaard that is known as The Present Age, compared to many other pieces that are better known, such as Disease and Fear, Either Or. In many other publications it seems less significant. But Kierkegaard, back in 1842, tried to contemplate a new phenomenon in European culture, not in Denmark alone. That phenomenon was designated by him as shaping the space, institutionalization of this space, where things would happen that had never happened before. For example, Plato's Academy, or medieval universities used to be institutions where education was implementing itself as part of creativity. Whereas gradually you see this sphere becoming a separate sphere in its own right, that is becoming more and more diffuse, uncertain, something that Kierkegaard would call anonymous. He would call it anonymity of the public. And he points out that the public is not about generation. No, the public are not some kind of purple in front of you specific. It's some kind of universality. It's something anonymous, something fragile and something uncertain and vague. And this is where he sees dangerous symptoms of organizing the space along these lines, which are made even worse with a new phenomenon that he called journalism. Can you imagine, for example, in mid-19th century, and think of the journalism they had at that time and of today, but Kierkegaard sensed even at that time that this is something that is creating an atmosphere well, in general, of a general anonymous idle talk, das Gerede, talkativeness. Some kind of talk that doesn't have an author, that has nothing to do with, that does not come from any specific mind, like Manzac, as on dit in French. Who says, what does they say? Kierkegaard speaks about the danger of the spirit when, through this verbosity and prolixity, they try to hide behind them inability for action. This is what we face when, during this excessive proneness for theories, we look at different attitude towards reality, where people reassess the importance of theories, attempts to believe that thinking can exhaustively explain the reality to us and transform it. This is where we see serious encroachment on what doesn't require from us real thinking. Remember what Bratinsky said, there is being, but depending on the name you give it, this gap, this tension, this ontology, it's not about empty category. This is what our life stands for. It's our existence. And at all times, this life does not allow itself to articulate with the help of these habitual words of the language, this Gerede, using this talkativeness, these idle words that are so many, so plentiful, that we seek to stay within this sphere. This is something that is hiding reality. We are facing a situation where we need to find another language. I would like to draw your attention once again towards the words by Kant, who is a genius in his day, as he realized that here's this utterance. Man is stands for a certain vice. As Kant understood that, said that enlightenment was needed. Sapere aude is actually an urgent hope, existential hope that humanity can be rid of its depravity. But this is what he says in the criticism of pure reason. This is the phrase he begins his work with. Human reason has a very strange fate. It is perplexed by questions it can't stay away from because they are imposed upon it through its own nature. But at the same time, it cannot answer them because they go beyond what human mind can cope with. These are the questions we call the damned questions, eternal questions. But we cannot but ask ourselves these questions, because this is the love. They always come to our mind, even if we seek to hide away from them. At a certain time, they would quite unexpectedly come out. What is our life for? How we realize tap our potential. And when we try to give answers to these questions, our reason is immersed into darkness and forced into contradictions. An attempt to ignore the fact that these problems are not unambiguous, that each of us is doomed to look for and find our own answers to these questions, should become the thrust of what is known as education. And speaking about Kant, we tend to forget that Kant has traveled a long path in his development. He started with philosophy and then realized that there are many things about this philosophy that sort of hide away most important things in philosophy. Most of schools of philosophy are epigonic in their nature, and it was right. It would call itself a specialist in social theory. And a good example that Hannah Arendt in some unexpected manner, would point out that the last critique of pure reason, critique of ability to reason, is a piece of genius and is yet not fully appreciated germ of political theory. At first sight, something wrong happens here. Traditionally, the last critique by Kant is perceived by us as something that sought to continue what Kant did in his first pieces. He analyzes cognition and what cognition stood for as towards nature. In the second critique, he tries to come up with the principles of human freedom and the way man should live his life. And this is where he goes to another sphere, art and creativity. And this is where it turns out that any attempts to use the principles that he used in critiques number 1 and 2, and that was a must for Kant because he wanted to finalize, it didn't work. Why? Because Kant, he is faced with a situation where you can't get a common norm and rule for cognition. It can't be applied to general cases. Because when we are facing something elevated and beautiful, it is something that evokes emotions in us. It is out of rules, disobeys the rules of logic. We like something not because we prove ourselves that we should like it. There is a rough Russian saying that says that love is something that can make you fall in love with, that it turns you blind to the evils of the one you love. And this is what we are faced with, that Hannah Arendt is saying. Theory should transform itself in such a way that one should be more attentive. We should pay more attention to the factual and actual things. I'm actually from Belarus, a country that, as you know, became recently, in recent years, much rather known only through the name of its president. In the long run, for a long while, the West was just amazed at what was going on there. And one used to be speaking about it as the last dictatorship in Europe. That was commonplace word. And it's also forgotten. Belarus is a unique country in post-Soviet space, where the leader was elected democratically, a person who had nothing to do with nomenclature, he had no infrastructure. When he was elected, the West was ironic about how could this come. He former chairman of a kolkhoz collective farm. And when Belarus was visited by President Clinton with certain expectations that that would be the country where they could come up with most recent progress towards democracy. If we look at the expectations of that time, when the American president doesn't go somewhere out of nowhere, he looking where Belarus is now, the difference is truly great. At a certain time, I'm saying that about Belarus, there were so many conferences and seminars in Berlin, Warsaw, Vilnius. One could publish a book only quoting the names of conferences and seminars. That would suffice. And what came out of it? Do we still believe into the words of magic words? Moreover, it turns out that it's now enshrouded in silence. The question is, if this particular case where they would apply abstract principles that would not work. How can you work in more sophisticated situations? Speak about education. Apologize for speaking so long. This is a book, for that matter, a very interesting book written by Denisevich. It's known as Excellent Sheep, subtitle Miseducation of the American Elite. Why excellent sheep? Well, cell, this is something where you can drive the sheep to. And it turns out that he speaks about education, where the United States, where top universities in the United States, they say that people are miseducated, both Harvard and Yale, for sure. It's not, say, medical technology or IT or physics or chemistry. What causes most surprise and reproach has to do with us, the humanities. And we sense that our jobs, both as teachers, philosophers, economists, political scientists, becomes more and more risky because fewer and fewer people believe us. In one of the research projects that was run 3 years ago and published in Die Zeit, that said that every year in the modern world on social and humanities they publish 1.5 million articles. About 80% of them are not read at all. They are. If this happens again, if this goes on when these published books are not read anymore, then we would find it even harder to find our way there. So what we see is that towards ourselves and our feeling of responsibility, a question rises which we should answer in practical terms. In its day, on his day, Aristotle, in 6th book, Nicomache's Ethics, he said that it should become part of our paradigm for our behavior as a whole, not only for research or for training, for teaching. He used to speak about phronesis. This is not knowledge per se that exists in universal forms and then ready to be used in each particular case. Phronesis is knowledge how to behave, what to do. This is knowledge what to do. This is what we know by the word know-how. It means that my practical abilities do not automatically follow from theory. I may study and really get to know very well the theory, for example, how to swim. I can even teach this theory to people, but I may not even know how to swim. And in his policy, Aristotle says, in order to teach others, you need to first know how to do it and to be able to do it. And we looked at the magic formula, more magic words that sounds very beautifully. It's known as critical thinking. But the first question that arises is thinking, if it's true thinking, that can be non-critical? Is it possible? And secondly, based upon what reason each of us perceives that, imagines that, in order to critically look at something, we've got the rights and the authority to do it. Maybe that critical attitude first needs to be directed towards oneself instead of treating others critically. And now, at every level, discussions and debate is on that I'm not against it, but way too often, and people know the wrong way to do things. But instead of showing just in practical terms how to do it properly, then words would be unnecessary. I'm very pleased to be here because this year our university and the School of Political Studies, as it turns out, were created in the same year. And I believe that, anyway, there are two initiatives that go hand in hand. They were our attempts, success or not success, I do not know, but they were practical attempts, driven by practical ideas, and thank goodness that the school carries on and the university is still around. I suppose that if today's meeting and many others serve to strengthen institutional cooperation in order for us to face practical challenges and stop going for talkativeness, I suppose that would serve the purpose. Thank you.